Washburn, live and local on News Radio 1029 KARN.
One of the wonderful things about doing a live radio talk show every day is that from time to time we get to talk to folks who are in the news, folks who are quoted in newspapers, folks who may have sound bites on TV news. And the different thing about doing a live radio talk show is that they get to come on and present what their points are they're trying to get across without being edited. Talk about things in real time. Now, we have two guests for this segment between now and 3:30. We have the Reverend Rob Schenck. Now, he is a Christian and American evangelical clergyman who ministers to elected and appointed officials in Washington, D.C. His organization is called Faith and Action, and the website is faithandaction.org. And we also have Erich Pratt from Gun Owners of America. Gun Owners of America, well, former Congressman Ron Paul calls them the only no-compromise gun lobby in Washington. And let me see if I can bring them both on the show here at the same time. Reverend Shank, I'm just going to read a little quote about you from the Washington Post, and then we'll let you tell us if they're taking anything out of context and basically where you're coming from, and then we'll let Erich Pratt also respond. The Washington Post says that you believe that most Christians should not own a firearm for defense purposes, and you're trying to encourage Christians toward becoming more visible in the gun use debates. And so that's kind of for starters, and you can take it from there.
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and secondly, it's an honor to be on with Erich Pratt, because the Pratt label is an important one to me and one that I respect very highly. So it's nice to have this conversation, though we probably disagree on a number of points. Yes, in one sense, it's out of context. And by that I mean I see the gun question as part of a very large and complex discussion on Christian ethics and morality.
All right.
So I would have to put it in the context of a very big topic, and of course you can't do that in the pages of the Washington Post.
Yeah, they seem to have their own agenda, and of course you have for many years been known as a pro-life activist when it comes to March for Life and praying and working against abortion and all that kind of stuff. And if I guess come to the gun issue kind of late. Okay, let me ask this way before we turn it over to Erich Pratt. Do you believe that scripturally a case can be made for Christians defending themselves and their families with deadly force?
Absolutely, I do. Absolutely, and unequivocally, I do. However, I'm going to qualify that in only the sense that, sometimes there are those things, as St. Paul says in the Bible, that are allowed, that they are permissible, but they may not be expedient. It may not be the best way to do it. And I would question whether in lots of instances, if not in the majority of instances, taking on a weapon, a lethal weapon, is the best way to defend ourselves or to approach the whole question of self-defense. So that's really where the rub is for me. It's very narrow, very specific, and it has a lot to do with our intention, what's going on in our hearts and in our minds more than what's going on in our hands and on our belts.
Okay. All right, Erich Pratt, Gun Owners of America. What Reverend Shank just said isn't nearly as clear-cut as the message that I thought I was getting from the mainstream media. What's your counter, sir?
Well,
Again, it's also a pleasure for me to be here with you, Doc, and with the Reverend Shank. Thank you so much for having me. And actually, I'm glad to hear what the Reverend said, because, I, too, in reading some of the things that he'd written, such as in the Washington Post last October, saying, quote, there's an impulse toward lethal self-defense that's contrary to Christian thinking and teaching, it did seem that he was taking a more hardline stance against self-defense. So I'm glad he's not, because I do think the right of self-defense is taught throughout the Bible, and I would say it is the pro-life position, and defending the lives of your loved ones is the loving thing to do. A good friend of mine is a missionary in South Africa. His name is Charles van Vick, and he was worshiping at the same St. James Church in Cape Town one night when several terrorists entered with machine guns and bombs, and thankfully only 11 people were killed. And I say only because Charles pulled out his .38 snub-nosed revolver and shot one of the terrorists, which sent them all fleeing. Now, I would say Charles did the loving thing for his friends that night. He shot back, and scores of lives were saved. And I would add even more, Charles' example clearly shows that using lethal force in self-defense is not inconsistent with love, because after the attacker he shot was arrested, he actually went and visited him in prison, shared the gospel of Jesus Christ with him, and later, when this terrorist introduced Charles to others, he said, first Charles gave me a bullet, then he gave me a Bible.
Wow.
Now, that's true biblical love through and through, both defending life and demonstrating forgiveness.
Reverend Shank, your response, sir.
Well, I don't know this, Charles. I would say he's an extraordinary individual and deserves to be commended for what he did. And thank God he was there. I will say that not everyone is like him. And I've met quite a few people who are not and have a different kind of disposition, different kind of attitude, some of whom are very angry, some of whom are very fearful, very afraid of other people and situations. Some folks that I've talked to in this debate who are armed, and in fact have been armed as they have talked with me, get very emotional, very exercised, seem to lack a kind of personal self-control. And by the way, I'll just say tangentially or in the sidebar, that for me this really isn't a question of gun control. It's a matter of self-control, which is a Christian virtue. And I think, and that's where I entered the conversation. It's where I think the conversation belongs. I don't think there is a legislative solution to this. I think that it's a moral and ethical solution. And I think this guy had his moral and ethical act together. I'll offer my own illustration of a South African story by a minister friend of mine who is a gun owner, was a gun owner, I should say, had several weapons in his home when it was broken into in Cape Town. Lots of his personal belongings and valuables were stolen. He came back, and the only things left in his house of any value were his firearms. And he said, at that moment, I could think of only one thing. And I won't use a vulgarity on the air, but I'll say, he said, I'm going to take my pistol and I'm going to go shoot the bees.
Yeah.
And he said, when I thought that, I realized I am capable of murdering. And I never thought I was. And at that moment, it was a revelation to me. And he said, I took all my firearms. I took them to the local police station. I surrendered them. And I said, I'm a potential murderer. And I don't think I should have these weapons in my hand. So I think all of us have to come to terms with ourselves on this question. And it's a very, very serious matter of personal introspection.
Well, yeah, but what do you do with the argument that guns are just a tool, and that many people were murdered for many centuries before we ever had guns? I mean, Cain and Abel, no gun was used there.
Sure, exactly. Although I often ask people, would you rather face a baseball bat or an AR-15? There is a qualitative difference between the two.
Well, yeah, but the thing about that, and I hate to steal Erich's thunder because I'm sure he could do this better than I could, but I haven't seen yet a plan to get guns out of the hands of the bad guys. It's interesting you said there's no legislative answer. The people who are putting legislative answers out there are tending to want to make it more difficult for law-abiding citizens to have guns. I mean, you know, Mexico is supposed to be a gun-free society. Doesn't seem to be working too well. You know, the bad guys still have the guns. So,
you know,
Well,
I'm sorry, let me let Erich Pratt jump in here for a second.
well, I was going to say it's an interesting thing that the United States is one of the most heavily armed nations in the world. We've had, over the last 25 years, an influx of 150 million new guns that have been manufactured or imported into the country. And yet our homicide rate has actually dropped in half during that time. So we literally have more guns, less crime. And that even includes concealed carry. Since President Obama entered office, we've had the number of concealed carry permit holders that have tripled, and yet our murder rate has fallen 25% during that time. I agree wholeheartedly that you cannot legislate against a hard issue, and unfortunately that's often what the gun control proponents want to do, is they want to use a law to take guns out or restrict access to firearms. But as you were pointing out, Doc, it doesn't work. I mean, France has much tougher gun control laws than we do, and it didn't stop their terrorists from getting firearms and committing horrendous acts last year.
Although a couple of weeks after ISIS slaughtered 130 people in Paris, our president went to Paris and said that mass shootings only happen in America. He said it in Paris, which I guess is kind of tangential to our discussion right now. We are speaking with Reverend Rob Schenck of Faith and Action in D.C., and also Erich Pratt of Gun Owners of America, and our conversation will continue here in mere moments. The Doc Washburn Show continues. You got it. News Radio 1029 KARN. Hey, do you have a slab foundation in your home? Do you have a funny odor at your place? Well, that smell could be coming from your duct work. If so, there's a solution that does not require replacing or the expense of huge demolitions, not to mention the fact in the meantime you and your family are breathing in that awful air. Well, say goodbye to rusty and moldy ducts and say hello to Jet Seal. It's a new product that coats the ductwork from the inside, so you don't need any kind of expensive demolition. The rubberized duct liner, it's perfect for plastic ductwork, mold remediation, underslab ductwork, allergen reduction, elimination of fire and smoke odor. And, of course, the coating material is environmentally friendly and has been rigorously tested for safety. Now, there are a lot of in-slab duct systems in Maumelle, Leawood, Indian Hills, the Heights, Pleasant Valley, all over the place. And next to your family's health, your home is one of the most costly investments you'll ever make. So don't put it off. Process usually takes about 1 day or less. If you delay, it could result in a much bigger expense later. Jet Seal does residential and commercial jobs. Been doing it since 1989. The website is jetseal.com. That's jet with two T's. JETTSEAL.com. Or just call them at 225-SEAL. That's 225-7325. Jet Seal.
Doc Washburn for the ride home.
You just have to learn to deal with it.
Live and local.
I just work here. I don't know.
On News Radio 1029 KARN.
If you're a 50...
Everything good for your mind, body, and soul. The Core.
Ever since its popularity began in the 80s, it's like second nature to go for the fat-free or no-sugar varieties of some of your ordinarily full-fat favorites. But are you really doing yourself any favors? Well, nutritionists say there are some that you're better off going for the real deal, like peanut butter. The difference calorie-wise is not that great, and really when they take the fat out, they then increase sugar and other additives to replace the fat they took out. Same with salad dressing. In fact, nutritionists stress that you need a little fat on your greens to absorb those antioxidants. So when they take out the fat, again, it's a lot more sugar, kind of defeats the purpose. And you're going for turkey bacon over the real thing? Well, nutritionists say it's not that great of a difference between the two. They're both highly processed meats, and in general, you should limit your bacon intake in general. They're not making any friends with that one, are they? That's the Core. Macy's, thanks for sharing one of the best events for Macy's cardholders. Join today. Get rewarded big time. See a Macy's sales associate or visit Macys.com/thanks.
It's Kevin Miller. On First News this morning, we had conversations with Congressman French Hill and U.S. Senator Tom Cotton about the president's executive action on guns. Heather Bennett from Little Rock Family had a rundown of the weekend events, had a chance to have some fun with Warwick Saban and Joel Gordon from the Innovation Hub, and find out more about what they're doing, including upcoming classes and their event, Beer, Brats, and Bots. We've got that info on our Facebook page. Tomorrow morning, we'll talk to Governor Asa Hutchinson. Dan Harpool from Complete Computing will give the info on the latest tech and gadgets coming out of the Consumer Electronics Show. Movie critic Kevin Carr runs down the weekend releases, and we'll find out what's going to happen at the Gillette Coon Supper. It's all a part of First News tomorrow morning, 6 till 9 o'clock, here at News Radio 102.9 KARN. Now back to Mr. Doc Washburn.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. We are having a conversation with Erich Pratt. Erich Pratt of Gun Owners of America, and also Pastor Rob Schenck of Faith and Action in D.C. If you've heard Rob Schenk's name before, it's probably because he has been a pro-life activist focusing on helping women and children for decades in Washington, D.C., and also ministering to folks in the government there in Washington, D.C. Erich Pratt, of course, we've had on the program before and had his dad on, executive director of Gun Owners of America. In my mind, the premier Second Amendment civil rights organization in America. All right, so Mr. Pratt was last. Let me go back to Reverend Shank. You were saying that you agreed with Erich Pratt that it was a good thing that his friend in South Africa did have a gun and was able to shoot at a terrorist and save a lot of lives, and then go witness to that same terrorist, share the gospel of Jesus Christ with him in jail after that. And you also said that we're talking about a heart issue here. The gun violence issue in America is not really going to be dealt with legislatively. So I guess the logical question is, how do you think we should deal with this?
Well, I think first of all we should deal with it in a Christian way, and I'm speaking specifically to Christians these days, especially pastors about it.
Yeah.
And that would begin, certainly as a topic for preaching and teaching on the part of pastors, certainly within Sunday schools, Bible study groups, etc. And my mentor for the last 10 years at least on this has been the man I call my best dead friend, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the great hero during the Nazi horror in Germany, pastor who gave his life for the gospel.
Yep.
And Bonhoeffer said, when we read the Bible, we have to be careful to read it against ourselves, not for ourselves, but against ourselves, because it challenges us.
Yes.
And I would say in this instance, it challenges our assumption that we're always the good guy. We all know the famous slogan, I think made most famous probably by the NRA, the only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun.
Yeah.
Well, who's the good guy? Especially if you're reformed in your thinking, and we believe strongly in utter depravity, that is our complete sinfulness.
Yeah.
That means I'm actually in every way potentially a murderer. So we're talking about putting lethal force in the hands of potential murderers. That's a serious question for the Christian, but also for society as a whole. And that's why I think we do this right in American society. We delegate this very problematic task of using lethal force to police officers, members of the military who are highly trained, highly rehearsed, and highly regulated in the way they use lethal force. When a person goes and just buys a gun at a gun shop or a gun show, takes it home, and says, I'm ready now to make that decision of who is a mortal threat and who deserves to die in a violent confrontation, I'm not sure we're prepared for that.
Okay, let me turn to Erich Pratt here. Pastor Shank is saying that the issue of gun violence is not going to be dealt with legislatively. He's talking to pastors. He's concerned about how angry and emotional people get even discussing this issue. And I'm wondering, Eric, if the idea, because our Lord tells us that to have hatred in our heart for our brother is as bad as murder, to me, the issue of the heart and the hatred and the anger is kind of separate from what kind of tools I might have around the house to defend my family if need be.
Well, exactly right. When Cain killed his brother, God dealt with him, but he didn't institute rock control. The answer has never been controlling or banning or restricting access to the instruments. It's always been about self-control, and Pastor Shank has referenced that, but it really is a matter of the heart. But that's why you have passages that actually, and this recognizes the sinful world that we live in, you have passages that actually encourage and justify self-defense. Passages like Exodus 22 that says killing in self-defense is justified. There is no blood guiltiness on your hands. Or you look at Esther, chapters 8 and 9, where the Jews defended themselves with arms and killed their attackers, which, by the way, is significant because Jesus would never have been born if his lineage was wiped out during the time of Esther. But the Jews were able to attack and or defend and destroy their attackers. And then, of course, as you referenced, Doc, Jesus in Luke 22:36, where he told his disciples to sell their cloaks and buy a sword if they didn't have one. So all these passages support the biblical principle of self-defense. You even have Jesus saying in Luke chapter 11, when a strong man fully armed guards his own house, his possessions are safe. Now, Jesus was using an example from the physical world to make a spiritual point, but his statement reflects the truth of using arms in self-defense.
Pastor Shank, go right ahead.
Well, I wouldn't have a controversy with Eric on a number of those points. Here's where it becomes difficult for me, and maybe it's because of my pastoral experience. I've been in full-time Christian ministry for 34 years now, and I've had experience with a lot of people, a lot of families in conflict, a lot of domestic abuse situations, a
lot of counseling,
a lot of guns, a lot of mentally ill people.
Yeah.
And here's where the problem comes, and that is when you give someone the power of life and death in their hands, they have to be ready to use it properly.
Yeah.
And I'm skeptical of that. I'm quite skeptical that the vast majority of us have a capacity to do that, and that's why we limit it. That's why we say, you know what, these people under these conditions will be able to use deadly force, but only under these conditions and not just anywhere. And I go right to the passage that Eric referenced in Exodus, which gives restrictions on when you may use lethal force, at night and not during the day hours. Well, does everybody know that? And in other words, is everybody ready to make that judgment call? There's sufficient light to see what the intruder is doing. No, there is insufficient light to see what the intruder is doing. And maybe that's just something we have to work on in our culture. And I do think that's how this is going to emerge. We're going to come to a moral and ethical consensus. The better we equip our people, and that's my message to pastors. Look, take this on as a matter of preaching, teaching, pastoral guidance, and pastoral counsel.
Doc, can I address that?
Yeah, we got about 1 minute before the news, and then I appreciate the fact that both of you have been willing to stay after the news about the hour. Go ahead. Got about 1 minute.
The Exodus 22 passage does put limitations on self-defense, but not in the way Reverend Shank, with all due respect, the way he articulated. Let me read the verse. If a thief is caught breaking in at night and is struck a fatal blow, the defender is not guilty of bloodshed, but if it happens after sunrise, the defender is guilty of bloodshed. Notice this is talking about a thief. It's talking about a thief. So in the sunlight, you can see that he's running off with your sheep. You don't have the power to kill for merely defending property. And that's the way when King Alfred took these laws and made it the law of England and it became part of the common law and spread to the United States, that is the way it has always been in the common laws. You have a right to defend yourself, your life, whether it's dark or light, but you don't have the right to kill in defense of property alone.
All right, we are speaking with Pastor Rob Schenck, Faith in Action in D.C., and also Erich Pratt from Gun Owners of America. And I really appreciate the fact they've both been willing to stay with us past the bottom of the hour, because I didn't think we were going to solve this in just a half hour.
for white patients. For more information, talk with your doctor or visit mayoclinic.org.
News, weather, traffic, and Doc Washburn. Live from Little Rock on News Radio 1029 KARN.
All right, delighted to continue our conversation with a couple of fellows that I definitely refer to as brothers in Christ. Pastor Rob Schenck of Faith and Action in D.C. The website is faithandaction.org. And also Erich Pratt of Gun Owners of America, and his website is gunowners.org. And Pastor Schenck, let me ask you, you're talking about what another organization said, the only thing to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. And, of course, we're all sinners, so, you know, we're not that good, really. We're all sinners. Let me ask you this. I'm thinking about the terrorist attack in Paris, where 130 people were mowed down, very strict gun control laws over there. And I understand that, you know, you're saying this is not a thing that can be addressed legislatively. I got all that. But, you know, when we hear people say, well, God bless our troops, or God bless the police, et cetera, well, golly, you know, they're sinners just like the rest of us. You know, if you want to look at it that way, we're all bad guys in the sense that we have all been weighed in the scales and found wanting. We have all fallen short of the glory of God, et cetera, et cetera. However, saying that these folks who are trained, the law enforcement officers or whatever, those are the folks that should be bearing the arms, well, that kind of puts them in the position of being a good guy. I think that Erich Pratt's friend, Charles, who was able to save a bunch of lives in South Africa, even though he's a sinner too, just like the rest of us, in that sense, relatively speaking, he's the good guy because he is saving lives. Am I making any sense here? And the other thing is the old saying that when seconds count, the police are a few minutes away.
Well, yeah, of course, always hard to extrapolate, you know, a very wholesome principle from a single incident.
Sure.
Of course, it's always lamentable whenever anyone dies, including, by the way, an enemy. Because, I mean, if we look strictly at the greatest sermon ever preached, the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus says, don't resist an evil person, or love your enemy and bless your enemy.
Yeah.
These are extreme challenges to our human impulses. And you know, the scriptures speak continuously of bridling our impulses. And that's why we place police officers and members of the military under such strict regulations and give them such a high bar of accountability and require of them such a comprehensive degree of training and rehearsal for these events over and over, because we doubt a human being's capacity in these kinds of situations. And I would certainly, I mean, we see plenty of bad police officers, infinitesimal in comparison to the ones that conduct themselves honorably and according to the law and beneficially for all of us.
Sure.
But it does happen.
Yeah, and when there's a police-involved shooting, internal affairs tends to take over, and the officer is either on paid leave or on administrative duty or whatever, and they figure out exactly what happened before he gets to go back out on the beat.
Yes, and for me, it's the same principle that our founders used when they constructed our republic and placed three essentially competing branches in a way, the legislative, executive, and judicial, that all keep one another in check. Why? Because they doubted the moral capacity of anyone with power. So once you take on a lethal weapon, you take on power. You have power. You're the most powerful person in the room, period. If you're the only person armed, you're the most powerful person in that room. And you must be held accountable for that extreme level of power, just as a public official does.
I guess Erich Pratt, Gun Owners of America, to Pastor Rob Schenck's point there, we would think about if you're the only person armed in that room, it takes us back to the fact that most mass shootings in the last 35 or 40 years have been in gun-free zones where the really bad guy, the guy who wants to murder a bunch of people, knows that he's the only one who's armed.
Exactly right. If you go back to 1950, all but 2 public mass shootings have occurred in gun-free zones. So that would include the Navy Yard. That would include the recent mass shootings that we've seen last year in this country. Heck, it would include the ones that we saw in France. And that's exactly the point. In a sinful world that we live in, when you tell a bunch of people that they can't protect themselves, that just empowers and enables the one who wants to do harm. You know, I want to address the point, though, about loving your enemy, and obviously those are words from the Scripture. They're very important, but you've got to take the context to that, because passages like that refer to loving people through insults and slights. They teach us not to take revenge. They really don't have anything to do with situations where your life is in danger, and that's why you have passages like Exodus 22, where you can actually strike somebody and kill them in self-defense, and there's no blood guiltiness on your hands. Or the passage in Esther that I referenced, or the one in Luke where Jesus told his disciples to buy a sword. All those passages show that there's a difference between responding to an insult and not taking revenge versus responding to an attack on your life. I mean, otherwise, Jesus also said, give to everyone who asks you. So if we're going to take that out of context, I'd like to ask Reverend Shank, I'd like your car and your house, and will you give it to me? It's words from Jesus' mouth. See, and that's the problem if we just zap these passages out of the context that they're in.
Pastor Schenck.
Well, first, there may be a general misunderstanding here, and I want to make it clear. I'm not a pacifist. In fact, I believe there is a necessity for lethal force in an ordered society. I'm just skeptical about who might, be permitted to use that, and we haven't even started a discussion of individuals who have anger problems, who have paranoid or fear problems, who have depression problems. And when you enter those into the mix, and I've seen that as a pastor, of course, I've been in the homes of several suicide victims, and as soon as you introduce a weapon into that equation of depression, you have an astronomical increase in the rate of successful suicide. So we have to ask the question, who should own and use a lethal weapon? And that's just a matter of good common sense as much as it is a question of Christian ethics. And as pastors, and I'm speaking specifically to Christian leaders, we should be assisting our people in making those decisions about themselves, about their families, their homes, and about their neighborhoods and society.
All right, and we'll address that on the other side of the break. We're speaking with Pastor Rob Schenck, faithandAction.org, and also Erich Pratt, Gun Owners of America, gunowners.org. The word permitted. We got to come back to that as the Doc Washburn Show continues.
And that's Tech Trends today. Good luck out there.
Doc Washburn on News Radio 1029 KARN.
All right, we're speaking with Pastor Rob Schenck of Faith and Action in D.C., faithandaction.org, and also to Erich Pratt, Gun Owners of America, gunowners.org. Our lines are jammed with people calling in. I didn't even give out the phone number. If you guys want to wait till after the top of the hour news, we'll get you on. But in fairness to both Reverend Shank and Erich Pratt, we have to stay with them here for the next 10 minutes. Reverend Shank, right before we went to the break, you mentioned something about questioning, since there are so many people who have anger issues, so many people who are depressed, perhaps suicidal, mental health issues. You mentioned your concern about who should be permitted to own guns, and I'm curious here. The Aurora, Colorado theater shooter, the Charleston, South Carolina church shooter, the fellow who shot Congresswoman Gabby Giffords and a lot of other people in Tucson, Arizona, they all passed pretty thorough background checks. And I know you've said that this is not an issue which can be solved legislatively, so I'm wondering why you use the word who should be permitted to have guns.
Well, I do think, we've had now a long history in our country of organizing ourselves socially. I like to think of the best government on the local level, and I mean really local, like in a county or a town or a village or a city, because then the government is closest to the people.
Yeah, the federal government's out of control. We can all agree on that, yeah.
Yeah. And so, we have organized ourselves that way. And look, I believe in village elders. I think there are those who carry wisdom and good moral and ethical sensibilities with them, and I would include pastors in that collection. And we have now, over history, organized ourselves in a way where we've said, you know what? We can't always trust people to make the best judgments for themselves. There are people who are incapable of making those kinds of judgments. I pass them every day when I arrive at Union Station here, the main rail station in Washington, to walk to my office, and I have to walk a gauntlet of mentally ill people. And I dare say, with all due love and respect and concern for them, they do not have a capacity to make a good moral judgment about many things in their lives, but especially use of lethal force. So we have to say, how can we manage this problem as a neighborhood, as a town, as a village, as a county? And it's the reason I think we came up with people like sheriffs. And we said, you know what, we're going to give this judgment call to the sheriff, because he's going to be held, or she in this case now is going to be held responsible in a way other citizens aren't, and is going to be required to have knowledge and training and such, and I think that's a good practice.
Okay, I want to get Erich Pratt, Gun Owners of America, back in here, but I'm reminded of a couple of things. One is that in 1955, the sheriff told Martin Luther King Jr. he didn't need a gun for self-defense. Another, and I hope I'm not misunderstanding or mischaracterizing what Reverend Shank just said, I'm reminded of C.S. Lewis, who said, of all tyrannies, a tyranny sincerely exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive. It would be better to live under robber barons than under omnipotent moral busybodies. The robber baron's cruelty may sometimes sleep. His cupidity may at some point be satiated. But those who torment us for our own good will torment us without end, for they do so with the approval of their own conscience. Erich Pratt, the question is, if we're going to give a local county sheriff some kind of ability to decide who should and who should not be armed, wouldn't we then, to be able to do that, actually have to amend the Second Amendment?
Well, we would, or many of the other amendments. I mean, who's to decide what rights we then get to exercise? I'm an elder in a PCA church. What if I don't like Reverend Shank's teachings? So if I'm the sheriff, or if I'm the mayor, or if I'm the president, do I get to screen his sermons before he preaches them in order to ensure biblical accuracy? Because, in fact, we do have some serious disagreements. Now, I've actually been pleasantly surprised during the hour, but if I could humbly encourage the Reverend to be careful with the things he says, because in some of your writings, you for example, on January 2nd, you said anyone using a gun for defense must be ready to kill, and such a posture is antithetical to the term evangelical, which refers to the evangel or gospel. Well, with all due respect, I think that is unbiblical and dangerous, and I'll tell you why. My good friend Charles didn't always carry a weapon. The only reason he did that night of the St. James Massacre was because prior to that, he had heard my father, who's also a PCA elder, speak on the biblical right and duty to defend life. And Charles' testimony is that he was convicted by this teaching, and so he started carrying a weapon. Pastor Schenck, I think your writings discourage people from the duty of self-defense. But on the other hand, my father ended up being truly a godsend to that whole community because it saved Charles' life and the lives of many other people.
Reverend Shank, go right ahead.
Well, Eric, you're right. I am trying to discourage people from taking on the power of lethal force in their hands, at least to approach it with great skepticism, mostly about oneself, and I include myself. The reason I have chosen not to own firearms for defensive purposes, in fact, I don't own a firearm, period, but I've made that decision after being trained, by the way, and trained very well. It's very, very good instructor. And it was after that experience I decided, no, I won't. And one of the reasons I do not is because I doubt myself. In the moment when I am angry, when I am flushed with adrenaline, when I may feel retributive for something, vengeful for something, I doubt my own ability in that moment to make the best decision if I had a weapon on my side, loaded and ready to kill. And I think it's a healthy measure of self-doubt for any sinner to say, would I make the right judgment call in that moment? And I think most of us should err on the side of preventing that tragedy from happening.
Erich Pratt.
Well, I would just say, the Bible says whatever is not of faith is sin. So if you can't defend your family in faith using lethal force, then don't. But please don't tell others to follow your lead. Don't impose your morality or, your fears of how you might handle that situation on the rest of us, because there are actually a lot of people who are handling it very properly.
I apologize for speaking over you. I didn't realize I was actually... I'm sorry about that.
Go ahead.
I apologize. I do want to make the point that suddenly you sound like a pro-choice advocate. We've been dealing with that argument for a long time. Don't impose your morality on me. That becomes a free choice.
That's what you're doing, because you're not preaching the Scripture. You're preaching your own fears.
Well, what I'm saying is that all of us ought to be very mindful that we are, in fact, sinners, therefore disposed towards sin. So I'm more likely than not to sin rather than...
I get that. Responsibility is important. But look, we don't put blinders on men to prevent lust. And it sounds like you're trying to use a legalistic approach to say, don't even have guns. Don't use lethal force because you're going to abuse it.
Well, you can't revisit the question. And that's part of my argument, is that there isn't a do-over. Once the bullet has left the chamber and the barrel, it's very hard to say, oops, made the wrong judgment call, let's do that over again.
Well, don't you think Jesus realized that when he encouraged his disciples to carry swords, or when Exodus 22 said you can kill in self-defense?
Yes, although I would say there's a lot of room for further exegesis on both of those texts, and including the limitations that come with a sword. A sword is vastly limited in comparison to a semi-automatic, let's say, a Glock.
You know what? I got to jump in here, and we're going to have to leave it there. And I want to thank both of my guests, Erich Pratt, gunowners.org, and Rob Schenck, faithinaction.org. And I'm going to try to get this recording on SoundCloud.com this evening. We're up against a hard break. Top of the hour news, fellas. Thank you so much. God bless you.
Thank you, Doc, and thank you, Reverend Shank.
Both have a wonderful day. Thank you very much, and we'll take your calls right after the top of the hour news.